some dry clothes.
Hello, Zero Books readers and viewers. It's me again, Douglas Lain. Before I begin, I just want to point out that if you are someone who wants to contribute to the Zero Books podcast or through our Patreon, we're now offering this merchandise. This is the Aesthetic Dialectics coffee mug. That's supposed to be me. My roommate says that I look a lot younger, drawn in green than I do in real life. Them's the breaks. But yeah, people can now get these mugs. I have written a couple of essays. The topic for this video is the proletariat and the failure of the left to connect with the proletariat, and or the failure of the proletariat to be the proletariat and to usher in socialism. But I've written this essay as a response to Angela Nagel and Michael Tracy, who recently wrote an essay called First as Tragedy, Then as Farce, The Collapse of the Sanders Campaign and the Fusionist Left. For me, the difficulty with this essay is that it's too gentle with the left that it criticizes and leaves too many of the left's assumptions in place. For example, their critique of David Sirot's claim that a corporate-owned political system has almost never allowed an existential threat to corporate power to be elected president neither challenges the idea that Sanders represented an existential threat to corporate power. He didn't. Nor did it challenge the idea that the struggle for socialism should be understood as a struggle against corporatism as opposed to capitalism. They are also too quick to celebrate the social democratic parties that have succeeded in winning elections. While it's true that in Denmark and Ireland there have been short-term victories for social democrats, this ignores the low probability that these parties will succeed ultimately. They ignore how the political economic context of the present will make it more and more difficult for social democratic reforms to hold. For example, Denmark's social democrats want to expand welfare spending and decrease inequality, but the conditions in the global economy are such that they are presiding over an era where there is likely to be a massive increase in unemployment. There already is a massive increase in unemployment, and there already is a massive contraction in Denmark's GDP, just as there has been a contraction in GDP around the globe. So while it's likely that Denmark will suffer less than many countries in Europe, if the EU cracks up completely, and it's likely that the EU will crack up, and that production will slow generally, then half of the Danish economy will be threatened because half of the Danish economy is based on exports to and imports from the rest of the EU and the world. So an economic crisis in other countries will influence and impact and limit the social democratic reforms in Denmark. Now, Nagle and Tracy claim that the Americans' left's refusal to take up a socially conservative position or to take up some positions that are socially conservative, that this has limited the appeal of the social democratic platform when they've refused to meet the working class where they are. But what we should consider is how just the question of social values or social conservatism itself obscures the shared assumptions that the social democrats have with neoliberals. Social democratic parties in America or the UK may have limited themselves in terms of their appeal to more socially conservative workers. It's also possible that the working class didn't turn out for Sanders or Corbyn, not because they were put off by the strange internal culture of the DSA, but rather because they weren't convinced that the democratic socialists could actually achieve their agenda. The democratic socialists, or the social democrats around the world, often will have an inkling of the immensity of the task that they're charged with. For instance, in an essay for Jacobin called Social Democracy is Good but Not Good Enough, Bhaskar Sankara wrote that history shows us that achieving a stable welfare state while leaving capital's power over the economy largely intact is itself far from viable. But then he went on to suggest that moving beyond social democracy would involve pushing back against capital's power to withhold investment. His vision for how to overcome the limits of social democracy is that he would use the state to compel capital to invest. The problems that arise from a lack of or a decline in profitability can't be overcome, not even with the use of force, unless that force first devalues enough capital to allow for reinvestment, or that force changes the mode of production, gets rid of capital. So you don't try to push back against capital's power to withhold investment. You change the social relations so that the construction or development of capital is no longer the aim of investment. Okay, so what Michael Tracy and Angela Nagel miss is that it isn't this current left or just the American or Anglophone left that has a problem attracting working class support. But in fact, this difficulty with the proletariat has been the most prominent difficulty for socialists since the end of World War II, at least, and maybe even since the writing of the Communist Manifesto. So a good example of a difficulty that the proletariat presents to the left can be found in Horkheimer's 1943 essay on the Sociology of Class Relations. It was written while Horkheimer was living in exile during the Second World War, at a time when the failure of the German Revolution of 1918 and 1919 was as memorable to him as Back to the Future 2 and the fall of the Berlin Wall are to me. Horkheimer was convinced that the capitalist system had overcome its core contradictions and that the struggle for socialism had, at least for a time, ended. He was not quite the conservative Hegelian that Fukuyama was after the end of the Cold War, but he nonetheless believed that he'd reached the end of history. Why? Because the working classes could no longer be relied upon to act in the interest of socialism. Reading Horkheimer's critique of consumer society today, reading this essay he wrote in 1943, it seems culturally relevant to me, because we live in a society where we're all immature. We all seem narcissistic. We're all caught up in our own particular lives. We don't have connection to one another, but see ourselves through the things that we buy, say. But it's important to remember that this critique of consumerism came out of a theory that fundamentally misunderstood the base of society and overestimated the power of the state. So consumer society was supposed to completely placate the proletariat and be the major obstacle to overcome because Pollock and Horkheimer and Marcuse and Adorno and all these Frankfurt School guys thought that the state monopolies could overcome the contradictions that arise out of the production of value and out of market competition forever. In fact, they thought the state had done away with market competition, and they thought that market competition was the primary realm in which these contradictions arose. So putting this question of the proletariat in the context of the defeat of the Bernie Sanders campaign, we can all witness the current social democratic left wrestle with the failure of this moment to connect with the proletariat or with working class people. But we could put it differently and think of this as the proletariat's failure to endorse and support Bernie Sanders. So we can see people wrestle with this problem and this failure. And one of the people we can really watch closely is Matt Christman, who is live streaming his thinking process, and who in a recent live stream said that he didn't care very much about the question of revisionism in Marx. He was asked about it, what he thought about the problem of revisionism in Marxist thought. And he said that it should be dismissed because it was not really taken seriously, because it wasn't a question that made any sense in this moment, because it was just an esoteric question asked by people who were more concerned about developing their brands as revolutionaries, developing some fantasy version of themselves, rather than people who were truly trying to wrestle with political reality, that it was a question for another era. that it doesn't matter now. But I think, in fact, the question of revisionism, as esoteric as it might seem, is a serious question, because the ideas of Marx and the way we understand political economy shape the kinds of politics that we develop. Even if we think the political economy is irrelevant, that itself shapes the kinds of politics that we develop. Matt Christman's thinking is colored by the theoretical assumptions of the socialism that defined his era, which really goes back probably at least to Horkheimer, probably all the way back to Bernstein. In the 19th century, after the Long Depression, and a moment where there was a disappointment in the failure of the revolutions in Europe, and the fact that the economy was booming again. So the Long Depression ended. There hadn't been the development of socialism out of it, and instead there was a new era of a boom for capitalism. What people who were part of the crisis in Marxism put forward was the idea that we needed to revise our understanding of Marx's categories and reject some of Marx's ideas because they had been disproven by history. The workers' wealth was increasing. The workers themselves were fragmenting into sectors or rackets and unable to take up a universal struggle. But I think both Bernstein and Horkheimer failed to see how their historical moment arose and failed to understand that social reality was something that was moving and changing based on the law of value. That's left for would-be revolutionaries today, then, does need to be reframed. We need to take the fact of revisionism and the defeat that represented, and basically how the old defeat from the 19th century influenced and distorted Marxism. We need to take that into account. So that means that the problem for us is not that consumerism has created a conservative working class that's fragmented and in competition with other workers, and that will never be brought into an existential crisis by the contradictions of capitalism, but rather that when workers fail to respond to an existential crisis in self-defense, capitalism proves to be able to resolve its own contradictions. So at the end of Nagle and Michael Tracy's essay on the Sanders campaign, they claim that the left wing in America is willing to self-annihilate in order to save liberalism. But I think the problem for the left is that the proletariat are sometimes willing to self-annihilate in order to save capitalism. This sort of sacrifice is easier to accomplish than the kind that leads to self-transformation and the development of a new society. Now, I'm not saying the same thing as Horkheimer. I'm not saying that the contradictions of capitalism have been overcome and that the workers have just been bought off. I'm just saying that there may be no limit to the amount of pain and suffering and horror that the working class can convince itself to endure. You know, the thumbnail for this video features a picture of Michael Tracy and the mascot Gritty. A few years back, Gritty became an emblem for certain sorts of online leftists. I thought that he was a symbol of the left's countercultural uselessness and its embrace of neoliberal conceptions of liberation. And I still kind of think that. The fact that this is the creature that the left, online left, has chosen to embrace is symptomatic of this failure we've been talking about, the failure to connect to the proletariat, the failure to connect to power, to find a base. This is a revolutionary left that was described in a recent volume of Endnotes as a group of freaks and deviants, and that has been described as freaks and deviants since 1939, I think. There was an essay by Sam Moss where he described the radical revolutionary left as a group of freakish individuals who had turned on society and had developed a radical theory precisely because they'd failed to succeed in the society on its own terms, for personal reasons, as a kind of racket maybe. But I think that when crisis hits, the proletariat itself becomes freakish and more fragmented, and that it's only through the recognition and acceptance of that freakishness in each other that we might be able to come together. So it's only by understanding the errors that have brought us here that will lead us to ever overcome history. And one of those errors is the social democratic turn itself and the error of revisionism. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.